Hey everyone, I wanted to take some time to respond to the very important work that you all did on the discussion board with your instigators and your responses during the first week. Bear with me, I'm a bit under the weather, so I'm hoping my voice is not too scratchy, and I'm actually using Camtasia for this so that I can cut out like any coughing. Um, but just in case there's any weirdness, then you have an explanation. First, I just want to say how impressed I was with the conversation that you had. All of the important themes from the readings that I was hoping you would pick up on are definitely present in your discussion, and it was really refreshing to see how many of you have related experiences that you can bring to sort of flesh out some of these more difficult concepts. In terms of the Meyer and Riccardi discussion, I think it was a good thing that, as Tracy pointed out, there's a way that Meyer wants to help us identify difference, and Riccardi is trying to help us to overcome difference. And that's an interesting distinction, considering that both thinkers are really coming at this stuff from the perspective of intercultural communications. In a very traditional sense. One of the reasons why I included the discussions of high, low context cultures in the first week is because it is sort of traditional intercultural literacies fair. So, for example, if you take an intercultural literacies course in, say, a Department of Communications or a business department, that's stuff that you would commonly learn. But as you all rightfully point out, the binary between high and low context cultures is sort of an artificial and problematic one, particularly as Amy points out, when we could probably identify folks in our own lives, regardless of background, that would seem to fall somewhere along the spectrum between high and low context cultures in one that doesn't necessarily match up with their sort of official cultural designation. The other thing that came up in the conversation that's important to remember is that the concept culture is quite expansive and it's very difficult, therefore, to define. And that's how we're treating it anyway, because we want to think about the way that, for example, maybe a personality difference could constitute a cultural difference. You all did really fascinating work in your first essays when you were discussing these various groups that could be considered sub or counter cultures or both. You talk in your discussions about the fact that what's at one time a taboo will eventually become the establishment, and so these things are constantly in flux. So, which is to say, and that's like a common postmodern concept, but a lot of you were pointing out in your short essays that, even if something seems to be really avant-garde or really unusual or really countercultural, sometimes those things eventually make it into the mainstream, and then some other thing is coming out as a countercultural move. And so it's hard to sort of bracket off these things and pin them down in space and time because they're always in flux. And so if we think about something like high and low context as more process-oriented things rather than sort of hard and fast designations, that might help. Which is to say that designating something as a high or low context style in terms of communication might be a necessary parsing move to grapple with the complexity, and that binary thinking is not always useful. That said, for lack of a better something else, intercultural communication specialists have said typically Asian cultures are going to be more high context, and Western cultures are going to be more low context. And so just really great a job offering examples to support that kind of thinking. As Morgan pointed out, so another thing that came up that I thought was really interesting in that discussion was this idea of what to do if we're not sure. I think that you'll see that the readings we do this week really help to offer some frameworks through which we might think about how to deal with what someone might want for themselves versus what we project on them because of our own cultural backgrounds about what we think they want in terms of communication. So Tracy points out that context is everything. Morgan points out that sometimes even questions that the speaker means no harm by can easily slip into that area of microaggression. And so this idea comes up to sort of watch and listen. And Jenny points out, which I think is really important, that at a certain point, it's like we want to think about grace playing a role here. And this idea that difference should become acceptable and familiar and not just something that we're trying to sort of look at from a curiosity standpoint. And I think that that's where the microaggression comes in, is that maybe our questions of those that we deem to be from different cultural groups could be easily misconstrued as hinging on the voyeuristic. And that's certainly not what we want from our intercultural communication, intercultural literacies moments. Another point at which your conversation sort of addresses the need to not apply binary thinking to intercultural literacies is when Frances and others point out that the U.S. has many permutations. Some of you have also pointed out that different college campuses have their own kind of cultures. And so we could think about a Southern culture. I know Amy brings that up in her introduction and elsewhere, this idea that moving from the northeast part of the country to the south is, people do experience something of culture shock. I believe Barna is going to address the fact this week when you move into a different cultural space, at times you could even experience something akin to physical illness by virtue of culture shock. So these are all such interesting things to think about as we move forward with the course and with the readings and screening that you'll do this week. In your discussion of the Muhammad reading, I was really impressed with how many of you picked up on this idea of countercultural quirks, as Jenny puts it, and how these will eventually make it into the mainstream, into cultural norms. Brandon brings up the idea of authenticity, and a number of you relayed some of your travel experiences, particularly to Jamaica, and we're fortunate enough to have Celine in class, who's actually from there. And I was really intrigued by the part of the conversation where she said, you know, if you were to go there with me, it would be really, really different. I could show you a totally different side. Because I think that there's a way that as tourists, we know when we go to those kinds of all-inclusive spaces that we're not experiencing an authentic culture at all. But Mohammed wants us to notice that the whole notion of authentic versus inauthentic culture is problematic, because these things happen through the things that even we think as natural, like we think of pasta as a natural Italian thing. Actually, in Italy, if you go there, many Italian people do eat a lot of pasta, but Muhammad explains that that tradition did not necessarily come from Italy. And so there's this way that everything is sort of brought through these maybe processes that seem less than authentic. And so that whole idea of cultural erosion for profit is something that Muhammad wants us to notice, but he also wants us to notice that even that which appears to be super authentic can have some pretty surprising starting points. So Frances and Amy talk about, and others talk about the whole engagement ring phenomenon, and many students do find that part really upsetting because they feel duped in some way. And it's not like, it's interesting because I've taught this in this particular reading in an undergraduate course, and of course many of the young ladies in the room will be furious and really want to talk a lot about how mean-spirited and profit-driven the whole move is to convince a man that he must spend a 2-month salary on this piece of jewelry. But inevitably, at the end of the conversation, when I say, okay, how many of you are still going to expect a diamond engagement ring someday? The vast majority still say yes. And so there's a way that we play into these things, even though we know that they are somewhat fictionalized. And so this idea of heuristic thinking and shortcutting, it sort of is just helping us to peel away the layers of what we think of as culture and to sort of have a more authentic engagement with the concept. Because again, what we don't want to pretend is that there's some kind of a priori version of things that's more real than other things. And so you also all bring up this idea of fake news in relation to fictional osmosis. That's really, really interesting. All of these things lead me to think about epistemology as we think about it in rhetoric, which is to say, usually in rhetorical studies, when we talk about epistemology, we're talking about questions of knowledge creation, which is to say, where does new knowledge come from and who creates it? And so in the Platonic sense of things, of course, new knowledge comes from some kind of like world of forms where there are best versions of things. So let's think like a chair. So Plato says there's the actual physical chair that maybe you're sitting in, and then there's the idea of the chair up in the world of forms, which is by nature superior. And then you've got a painting of a chair, which is less is even more inferior than the chair itself, because it's a copy of a copy. And so there's this sort of like hierarchy. And then we've got other thinkers like Aristotle that says, hey, let's take a look at those copies of copies. Maybe they have more going for them than we think. And so these questions of where new knowledge comes from and who gets to be its creator come up quite a lot in questions of culture. And so we see that there are, as Brandon brings up, big business and profit-driven reasons that particular things come into being, and there can be sort of other ways that things come into being, but all of them are, again, very much in flux. Caitlin brings up how communication technologies complicate all of this, which was really fascinating as well. Tracy reminds us that culture and language are very intertwined, and her discussion actually reminded me of globalization, sometimes also known as Americanization. Anthony Giddens, who is a social theorist from England, has a really great lecture on globalization, and he talks about it as an inevitable process. So he says, if we read something like Thomas Friedman on Americanization, and it's kind of like this evil force, right? Giddens says it's part of a forward movement of human history that's inevitable. But by virtue of such movements, as Tracy points out, we have loss. And so that's something we want to think about in relation to intercultural literacies as well. Celine reminds us that that stories, that narratives become really, really important and in her post. And that sort of moves us on to think a bit about the everyday use reading, which you did a really nice job of discussing. So this is sort of a classic text to do with fetishizing, right? Because we've got the sister visiting home who, unlike her mother and sister who never left home, doesn't see the sort of everydayness, the utility of these objects. Instead, she's fetishizing them heavily. And so that's something that the author wants us to notice, that changes the whole texture of the object to fetishize it rather than see it as something that has just an everyday use. And so the other thing that brings up is this something that you all have brought up in your discussion as well, which is this struggle for identity amidst things like globalization. Because at points we can feel alien on all fronts, which is to say we can feel like we no longer fit into maybe some kind of place where we originate, but we also don't fully fit into where we fall now. And so this identity, this crisis of identity and how that gives way often to fetishistic thinking comes up. There's a great There was a great New York Times series about 10 years ago, maybe more, on social class, and there's this great essay that Tamara Lewins contributed to that collection called Up from the Holler. It's about a woman who was raised in the Appalachian region, and she was in foster care and then is sort of taken in by a relative and becomes a lawyer. And the whole piece is about how now in her sort of upper middle class life, she feels like she no longer fits in with the place where she came from, but she also doesn't fit in with her very educated group of friends. And so that's a similar theme that comes through in everyday use for our main character that, as many of you pointed out, Tracy points out the original context of the story in the 1970s and the Black Power movement and the author's implicit critique of such things in their execution, not in their ideologies. So this whole identity piece comes in. Morgan brings up commoditization and music technologies and how technology is changing things in terms of how we commodify certain things. A number of you brought up biblical texts as cultural artifacts. And then Samantha grapples with counterculture and wants to think about that in relation to health literacies. And then Frances has this fascinating discussion of privacy as a privilege versus a right. So many rich discussions this week, so I just want to thank you for your hard work. Typically, this is what I do. I try to wait until everyone's done so I don't steal anyone's thunder with the kinds of things that I want to highlight, but also because typically I'm trying to see if you hit on all of the themes I was hoping you would, and then I just fill in blank. So hopefully this is helpful just to highlight and to add to the thinking that you all did over the course of the first week of classes as you especially begin to figure out what you might want to do for your seminar papers. So please be in touch with any questions or concerns or ideas. Please do post your seminar paper ideas to that discussion board so that you can start to read each other's ideas, because often that can be quite generative for folks to see what other people are thinking. So I know some people have been private messaging me with ideas, and I think that's fine. It's a difficult assignment because it's excessively open-ended. So I understand that you kind of want to run your idea by me before your classmates, but you also want to run it by them, because even if someone ends up being inspired by your idea, they won't replicate it. So you don't have to worry about idea stealing in any way. So thanks again for your hard work, and I can't wait to see what you come up with this week, and I will look forward to your questions and comments throughout. Thanks very much for your patience. I know this is a day late. I just was having horrible coughing spells yesterday and couldn't really get through the video making. Okay, I will talk with you all soon. Thanks.